Okay, let's start. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to CCN's Challenges and Controversies session, where we will collectively discuss and hopefully debate the free energy principle. So as you may know, the free energy principle, or active inference, has been developed and applied in the neuroscience community for the past 15 years, particularly in the field of cognitive neuroscience and psychiatric research. And somewhat in parallel, it's developed into a good model and robust debate amongst philosophers, particularly there in the field of consciousness research and embodied cognition. And even more recently, the framework has reached formally into physics, where the maths have been unfurled to reveal Schrodinger's equations, Maxwell's law of electromagnetism and wave-particle duality. And this is all afforded by dynamical systems theory and Markov blankets, where spatiotemporal recursions of a single idea, the drive to minimize free energy, speaks to thingness across multiple scales, from quantum phenomena to large active particles like ourselves. So today in this session, I hope we can cover the core concepts in mathematics and its implications for the study of the human brain and cognition. And the format for the next hour and a half will see introductory remarks from our discussants for 15 minutes or 20 minutes apiece, followed by hopefully a lively debate and Q&A from the audience, so there'll be no prorogation here of our parliament. And to facilitate audience participation, we'll have one roving mic, and I've also set up a Poll Everywhere channel where you can submit your questions live now or during the introductions or during the discussion via your smartphone or your laptops. And so to do this, you go to pollev.com and enter a username, which is me, Rosalind M092, or you can go directly to pollev.com/Rosalind M092, and it's written on the boards here. And there you can submit your questions, and I'll pass them to discussants depending on how much time we have. We'll get through as many as we can. If we have a lot of questions, I'll be updating the live polls, so be patient if the polls fill up. I'll be putting a new poll on the same address. And do add your name and institution to the end of the question if you so wish. Okay, so to our discussants, they say that a good boxing match is not based on opponents of different abilities, but on matching opponents of different styles. And so today I think we'll have a very good boxing match. Since in the red corner and in the blue corner we have two exceptional scientists who have in some ways sympathetic views and ideas, but distinctive points of view. So in the red corner we have Professor Carl Friston. Carl is the scientific director of the Wellcome Trust Centre for Human Neuroimaging at University College London. Carl is the originator of the free energy principle and, you might say, has published extensively in the theory, from its development to applications across the fields I've mentioned. And in the blue corner, we have Professor Jeff Beck. Jeff is Professor of Neurobiology and Biomedical Engineering at Duke University and at Duke's Institute of Brain Sciences. And he is well known to this community for his seminal contributions to probabilistic coding, Bayes in the brain, in sensory motor domains, and also in higher cognitive functions, studying decision-making across species. So thank you both sincerely for agreeing to come and participate. So from the rumble in the jungle to the thriller in Manila, we now have the Battle of Bayes in Berlin. And so with that, for round one, let's welcome Carl Friston.
Well, thank you for that invigorating introduction. It's clearly a great pleasure to be here, and I'm flattered in a perverse sort of way, to be controversial. I don't think I'm normally cast as controversial, so that's good. The last time I had to do something that was controversial was to discuss different ideological positions under the banner of neats versus scruffies. I don't know if this is a sort of a dichotomy which people are aware of. I liken this to a sketch, a sort of pre-Monty Python sketch in England, where class wars were the thing in the 1970s and 80s. And here we have John Cleese and the two Ronnies talking about the class that they come from. And this tall gentleman here is upper class, and he looks down upon this gentleman here, who is middle class, who in turn looks down upon Ronnie Corbett, who in this sketch is very lower class. And I'm going to make the position, just to situate the debate, I'm going to make the argument that this hierarchy of ideological high churchness is paralleled in the Neats versus the Scruffys and the mystics. From our point of view, I'm going to associate the Neats with physicists, people who are in search of simple, unifying, neat explanations for everything. And I'm going to contrast that with engineers who are the Scruffys. And these are people who are much more pragmatic, and they want to know what works. So they will adopt anything that works. And from our perspective, that could be 20th century behaviorism, reinforcement learning, drift diffusion models, temporal discounting. If it works, use it. And then we have the mystics. Now, I usually have psychologists under that, but I thought there would be too many psychologists. You've got to keep the crowd on side, haven't you? So I've made them philosophers. We don't need to talk about them any further. So in 4 slides, my brief was 4 slides through the free energy principle. So here is the free energy principle in 4 slides. At its simplest, it just says everything that can change will change to minimize variational free energy. And that's sometimes articulated, particularly in philosophy, as self-evidencing. Now, free energy here I've expressed in terms of complexity minus accuracy, and that mathematically provides an upper bound on a quantity known as log evidence, or just evidence or marginal likelihood. That's the probability of some outcomes or observations given a model or my understanding of how those data were generated. So I'm going to focus on this decomposition as a way of understanding the role of minimizing complexity whilst providing an accurate explanation for the sensory observations at hand. And motivate the importance of that just by unpacking the different kinds of interpretation one could bring to bear to understand what this quantity is here, the log probability of some outcomes at some time, possibly in the future, given a model of how those outcomes were generated. And if you associate that log probability with value, what we're basically saying is that minimizing free energy is the same thing as minimizing a bound on value. And I should say, if you come from machine learning, this is exactly the same as the elbow or the evidence lower bound used in things like variational autoencoders. But from the point of view of a psychologist, it could also be value. It could be the sort of expected reward that you will obtain pursuing a particular course of action. So this can be regarded as a statement of the imperatives that underwrite reinforcement learning, optimal control theory, and indeed in economics, expected utility theory. So that's nice. That covers a large bunch of people. There are other groups of people who would think more in terms of information theory. So the negative of this value is called self-information in information theory, also called surprisal, and it is the quantity that's upper bounded by the variation free energy. And minimizing self-information or minimizing surprisal is essentially the same as maximizing the mutual information. And from that, you can spin off the principles of minimum redundancy, the principles of maximum efficiency, the Infomax principle of Ralph Linsker, and indeed the free energy principle itself. That in turn is nice because the expected, the time average of self-information is known as entropy. So what we're saying is, if everything has to minimize free energy, then it has to basically minimize over time entropy. And of course, that is the holy grail of self-organization in physics, synergetics. And of course, if you're a physiologist, it's just homeostasis. It's just keeping outcomes within physiological bounds, preventing the dispersion and the tendency to disorder that one normally attributes to the second law of thermodynamics. But there's a final interpretation here which might appeal to many of you in the audience, and that's this drilling down on this marginal likelihood itself. So if I interpret M as a model, a generative model of how these data were generated, then this becomes model evidence, also known as integrated evidence, which means that minimizing free energy is simply a statement of the fact that, or an imperative, to maximize the evidence for one's models of the world. And from that, we can develop the Bayesian brain hypothesis, evidence accumulation, and things like predictive coding. And that's largely the perspective that I'm going to adopt on free energy minimization. There's another move entailed by the free energy principle, which is probably less familiar to many people. It's not just about inferring the best explanation for the causes of your sensorium. It's also inferring what you're going to do. It's also about what are the best data or sensory samples that with my active palpation of the world, I can gather together in the aid of minimizing free energy or maximizing the evidence for my own models. And we're appealing here to very old ideas, first elaborated by people like Lindley in terms of optimal Bayesian design. So it's not about building good models of data. It's what are the best data you can go and actively sample from your world in order to afford the best kind of inferences about the causes in that world. And that's formally can be articulated in terms of perception being in the game of minimizing free energy, basically the difference between your posterior beliefs about hidden or latent states of the world at some time, possibly in the future, in relation to your true posterior, which is the bound, and this is the log evidence here. So policy selection in this expression here, where pi denotes a policy, is all about minimizing the free energy consequent upon taking a particular policy or acting on the world in a particular way. And all we need to do is to take the average free energy under our beliefs, our posterior predictive beliefs about the outcomes that would ensue if I did that. And if we apply that to the free energy expression here, we're now conditioning on a particular policy, and we're just slightly relabeling and rearranging the terms to express it in terms of a mixture of incentives and values. And I've written them down here in terms, there are a number of ways of unpacking this, and I'll do that in a second, in terms of instrumental and epistemic value. So what does that mean? Well, if I just focus on components of the terms of the expected free energy and pretend that we had an agent or somebody who had no particular prior preferences, no value, extrinsic value or reward preferences, then we're left with these two terms here. And it turns out that these are exactly, or this is exactly the quantity that's optimized in optimal Bayesian design. In the visual neurosciences, it's known as Bayesian surprise, popularized by people like Christoph Koch and Itti and Boldi. And mathematically, that is exactly the same as a mutual information between outcomes and their causes in the future. And of course, that is consistent with the principle of maximum efficiency or minimum redundancy articulated by people like Horace Barlow. Let's just now take two sorts of uncertainty out of the mix and see what this expected free energy looks like. And I'm hoping that you will start to recognize the terms. So the first sort of uncertainty is basically ambiguity. I have no ambiguity about what's out there beyond my sensations. I can see the states of the world directly, and that just leaves us with these two terms here that basically score the difference between what I will predict will happen and what I prefer will happen. And that's known as a KL objective function for KL control in optimal control theory, or if you're an economist, it's risk-sensitive control, to minimize the outcomes of behavior in terms of my expected outcomes in relation to my goals or what I prefer to happen. Now I'm going to take the final source of uncertainty, which is what will happen if I do that. And if we take both sorts of uncertainty out, we're right back to reinforcement learning, expected utility theory. So the expected outcomes or my prior preferences under what I think will happen. The point here is that these are all internally consistent and equally valid ways of trying to write down optimum behavior, but they are all special cases of one imperative, which is to minimize the expected free energy or maximize the expected evidence for your models of the world in the future. I won't go into this in detail. Rosalind has intimated you can extend this argument right down to quantum physics or right up to evolution, and many people have started to do that by putting a Bayesian gloss on in theoretical biology in terms of evolution. Practically, though, I just want to conclude with a comment upon the explanatory scope and what this actually means for people creating artifacts or creating prediction machines to explain, say, fMRI responses in the ventral stream. It is neat and simple. That's the whole point about being a NEET or a physicist. It's just basically saying what we have to do is to provide accurate accounts of our world, of the sensed world, that is as minimally complex as possible, thereby maximizing the evidence for me as a model of my world. And this complexity term is extremely important. It's just Occam's principle. And from that, we can motivate certain factorizations that simplify a generative model of the world. You can get into functional specialization as the neuroanatomical or functional anatomy that belies or speaks to that factorization. We can talk about redundancy minimization, the shape of receptive fields that maximize the information gathered from the environment, efficient coding, and so on. We can also think about this from the point of view of pragmatism and economics. What we're talking about, because we're using an evidence bound, we're talking about bounded rationality, slightly disingenuous use of the word bounded rationality from the point of view of an economist, but it's still bounded rationality. It's perfectly Bayes optimal, but it's using an evidence bound. And that is the definition of approximate Bayesian inference based upon free energy bounds. It also very gracefully accommodates heuristics that emerge in many different levels. So in economics, it would be Gigerenzer-like heuristics. These are just priors, empirical priors that have been inherited from your parents or neurodevelopment or some other form of Bayesian model selection. And if you're an engineer or a physiologist, then via the Janinski equality and Landauer's principle, there's a direct relationship between your ability to minimize that complexity cost and the algorithmic complexity that underwrites the thermodynamic cost of erasing bits. So if you've got the free energy minimizing solution, you have a bound upon the most efficient way to do it, whether you are dealing with cerebral blood flow as a physiologist or whether you're actually designing supercomputers and you want to minimize the amount of electricity required to solve a particular computation. So that's about it. Neat and simple. Evidence is equal to simplicity plus accuracy. Or as Einstein said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So there you have it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Carl. Next up, we have...
Not sabotage.
Extra free energy.
Sorry, thank you.
So hopefully I see we're getting questions through. This is great. Keep them coming. So just to remind you all, it's polev.com/Rosalind M092 while Jeff is getting ready and his mic'd up to respond to Carl.
Sweet. Yeah, we'll see. So, oh, thank you. I have a word of advice for anyone who's ever invited to do something like this in the future. read the fine print on the invitation. Because I got this nice little email and it said, would you like to debate Carl Friston? And I didn't really read the whole thing. I just said to myself, that sounds like a ton of fun. Like, what could be better? But I was under the impression that we weren't talking about the free energy principle as a unifying concept for cognitive computation, but rather as a theory, which has created a bit of a problem for me, because as a unifying concept for cognitive computation, Carl and I are in, I think, complete agreement. This is going to be an incredibly boring debate, so I'm sorry. Maybe we'll throw something, but it's not going to get too much better than that, because we are, as far as I can tell, largely in agreement on this question. There's another question, the question I wished we were addressing, which is free energy principle a unifying theory of cognitive computation? And I would say, I have a very slightly different answer, very different answer, which is somewhere between no and not yet, or it needs more, or, you know, it's not a complete theory, and I'll try to explain what I mean by that at the very end. But because we're largely in agreement on a lot of things, first thing I'm going to spend a lot of time doing is addressing popular criticisms of what I'm going to call the free energy framework instead of principle, because I think that makes more sense. And I'm not going to refer to it as a theory, though neither did Carl, I noticed. I was tallying not a single use of the word theory. Saw it coming. Oh, sorry. Actually, I'm going to put this down. So I'm going to spend a lot of time just talking about what are the common criticisms of the free energy framework, and addressing them, because I don't think that they're valid criticisms. And I'm going to end with talking about why I don't think it's quite a theory, or may not be a theory, but is nonetheless incredibly useful. Okay, so here we go. So here are the common criticisms of the free energy framework. They largely center around, they don't center around things like epistemic and intrinsic value. Those words don't pop up very often. Instead, they tend to take the form of something more like, wait a minute, why this obsession about surprise? After all, there are very desirable things that are very surprising. So if I'm minimizing surprise, aren't I eliminating all of these desirable things, like winning the lottery? The second criticism comes with, oh, you know, there's actually a really trivial way to minimize surprise. It's known as the dark room problem. What do you do if you want to minimize surprise? Well, you just stop sensing the world. Cover your eyes, go into a dark room. And these criticisms have been addressed many times. I think most, what was the name of the article that was the conversation between the philosopher and the physicist? Absolutely lovely. I had trouble reading it, but I'm going to rephrase that as I go through, and I think like maybe plainer terms, I hope. But here's a little exchange that made me chuckle. This is one of Carl's responses in a paper that he wrote a few years back, addressing this sort of issue regarding the active inference part of the free energy principle. So he did something that made me chuckle. I thought it was hilarious and brilliant. In his actual paper, he quoted a reviewer and then directly responded to him. This was brilliant for two reasons. So first of all, what better way to placate reviewer two, especially a reviewer who'd use a word like elid, than by actually acknowledging his use of that word publicly. Completely brilliant. Of course, my second response to seeing this was I had to look up what the word elid was. It turned out it's actually pronounced elide. And what it means is to conflate. So 10 points for knowing what the word elid means, and -5 for the missed opportunity for alliteration. Catastrophically conflating is a lot better way to say that. And here's Carl's response. I'm not going to read Carl's response. You can read it for yourself. But I'm simply going to try to explain it with a few examples. Okay, so here's how this goes. Oh, sorry, there was a, okay. Actually, let me pause for a second. Carl's response, I will not read it, I will simply summarize it, was to say that optimal behavior, there are two kinds of surprise that you have to worry about when minimizing free energy in an action selection, in an environment which you're also selecting your action. One kind of surprise is about the sensory input, and another kind of surprise is about your action, is about how surprising transitions between states become. And that's what I'm going to try to elucidate. So here's the basic problem, as a lot of people see it, in my opinion. So this is a typical RL-type problem. Here's a mouse. He's in a maze. He's never been in this maze before. He has a massive amount of state uncertainty because he doesn't understand the configuration of the maze. He doesn't know where the cheese is. He doesn't know where the walls are. There's a massive amount of uncertainty. What does a mouse do? He begins by exploring his environment, so he zips around. Eventually, he finds the cheese. And in an RL framework, he gets 10 points. He got the cheese. It's over, you pick him up, you put him in another spot in the maze, and then what does the mouse do? Well, he now knows something about his environment, so he says, oh, I know something about this environment, I now have an informed policy that will get me from point A to point B so I can get more cheese and therefore more points. There's something that's missing from this framework. And no, I'll just wave my hands. There's a step that's missing from this simple RL perspective, which is yes, there's a reward maximization. There doesn't seem to be a reward in the free energy framework, and maybe that's a problem, but there's also something missing. What does the mouse do when he gets to the cheese? This is a serious question. He eats the cheese. Right? Getting to the cheese, yes, it's rewarding, and you can model that as reward, but you can also model it as suddenly having a great deal of certainty about his actions. He's not surprised to find cheese. He's sure he's going to eat it. And I think that at a high level, I'm hoping to get a nod, and I'm not getting a nod. Okay. At a high level, I would say that that is the difference between the reinforcement learning and what I would call like this free energy approach for active inference. It's that there's two notions of surprise that we're doing: sensory surprise and surprise in your action space, or surprise in your transition probability space. Math, I apologize for the math, but he started it. Here's a simple Bayesian RL example. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this, that elucidates the difference between how policy and reward are related. So I'm going to frame this as a Bayesian reinforcement learning problem. So initially, you're a mouse, you're in a maze, you have some, in the absence of a control signal, which will eventually be you have some sort of, there are states that you would transition between, maybe just moving randomly through your environment, but of course you could exert a control signal and therefore execute a particular policy. What you'd like to do is you'd like to choose your control signal so as to minimize, it's tempting, it's so tempting. So as to minimize your cost or maximize your reward, they're the same thing. How does that work? Well, just for simplicity, because we want a simple example with an explicit result, we're going to assume that the cost of actions is simply measured in the KL divergence between your, sort of go with the flow prior of just randomly moving through states, as opposed to exerting the control signal U. And then, of course, there is some cost or reward associated with getting the cheese, or maybe just stagnating, starving, whatever. And we're going to call that C of S. So that's like the cost of achieving the state that is or the value of either not or achieving the state in which you have cheese, for example. So these are logs, we can do math, we move things around, and what we end up with is being able to show that our expected cost, or the negative of our expected reward, can be expressed as a KL divergence between our policy. Can you see my cursor? No, of course not. Maybe I should be using this. Yes. As the expected KL divergence between our policy and something that is kind of like a probability distribution. Not quite. There's some constants that we're neglecting, but they don't really matter. What we do is we're going to find the U that makes this as close to this as possible. What should we call this? Right? Well, okay, we got it from this, sort of single state cost. It ends up looking something like this. You can call that your policy, whoopsie, right? You can call that your policy prior, right? This is how you should adjust your control signal. You want your behavior to be like this, to maximize your reward or to minimize cost. This is the end point of this kind of reward maximization calculation. In contrast, this is the starting point of a free energy framework. You start with a policy prior. Zach Pickhouse says I cannot use the word policy prior. You start with a default policy, which says how you would move from state to state that you like, that is consistent with your goals. But you've abstracted away reward entirely. You just have this default policy. So at the end of the day, what has Carl really, we'll put it that. What has Carl really done? My view on this is what he's done is he's sort of come up with a equivalent but slightly different definition of what a decision-making organism is. So here's the standard decision-making formulation, right? There's going to be some data that's going to come into your brain. You're going to do some inferences, which is going to be something how you represent the world or represent your data, and then generate some action. So what do you need to do in the standard decision-making formula? You need to have a few things, right? An organism becomes defined by its inference engine, how it interprets data from the world. It's defined by its reward function and implicitly the goal of maximizing reward. Okay, this is the standard way to do it. And then, of course, what do you do with this information? Well, just like this, you find a policy that maximizes your reward. Alternatively, within the free energy formulation, or framework, or whatever you want to call it, an organism is not defined by reward, but is instead defined by its inference engine, which is an approximate distribution applied to a generative model. This is an important caveat. There doesn't have to be, this is sort of a little more general in the sense that there doesn't have to be a generative model that informs the, that informs the inference engine, but there can be. And a policy, a default policy, what you would do if you got to the cheese. If you knew nothing about the environment, your actions might be random, you don't even know about the cheese. If you do find the cheese, your actions become very clear, and that sort of thing is incorporated into this sort of default policy, the probability of eating the cheese given that you have cheese in front of you. And then, of course, there's the aesthetically pleasing feature that if you take this approach, beliefs and actions can be both selected by minimizing a single objective function, which is called free energy. It's pretty. So before I move on, I'd just like to poll the audience. Not electronically, that's really intimidating, just hands. What makes more sense? Like, reward or policy as a way of now they're equivalent, they're mathematically, if you have a reward function, you can find an equivalent policy that maximizes it. And to some extent, vice versa. It's a little messy, but it can be done. But which is better? Right, well, it's my view that it's really hard to say. I kind of have a sneaking suspicion that from an empirical perspective, policy is a better thing to think about. Because policy is what we actually measure in the lab. So how do you measure reward? Well, you don't measure it directly, you infer it. You put somebody in a room and you say, do you want Snickers or Skittles? What do? You behave, you perform an action. You say Snickers if you're a rational human being. Now, you can change this a little by saying, okay, Skittles or 75% chance of Snickers, and maybe get a better estimate of their reward. But at the end of the day, what you're actually measuring is people's behavior. It's the actions that people are taking when placed in an unambiguous state. That is a policy. You always directly infer policies in an experimental setting and never infer reward directly, right? Reward is something you compute from observations of someone's policy. So from an empirical perspective, this actually makes a little bit more sense. And so I like it. Just a couple more things I have to cover, even though I think they're lame. So there's the dark room problem. I think that some of these criticisms qualify as lazy or too. Well, no, I shouldn't have said that. I take that back. I think some of the criticisms that fall into this category are too high level for me to understand. So minimizing surprise is too easy. There is a great way to minimize your sensory surprise. You can go into a dark room, you can cover your eyes, you can simply stop participating in the world, and that's all fine and dandy. Now, the trivial response to this crazy criticism is to say, yeah, that's not going to last very long. Right? If you close your eyes, you will eventually die, you will stop making predictions, and everything will be surprising. Now, there's a bit of a sticky wicket here because if your actual prior says, with great likelihood, you live in a dark room, your predictions will be your prior predictions, and they'll still be pretty good. Now, we can play this game forever, turns out. Right, so the response is, well, total surprise minimization actually encourages life. You wouldn't do this. Okay, so I call this the pit cow rejoinder. This comes from my good friend Zach, who's seated over there and is probably going to bury his head in a second. I'm going to paraphrase a little conversation we had yesterday. I'm going to change the words to make me look good and Zach look bad. But it goes something like this. What if I brought nachos into my dark room where I'm blindfolded and my eyes are closed? not going to die. You might need a few other things if you wish to survive, but at the end of the day, yeah, that's what seems to be like a perfectly acceptable solution to the problem of minimizing surprise. So, what's your problem, Zach? What's wrong with this solution? Zach would say, you could just yell it. No, Zach would say, I would never do that. And I would say, well, I mean, it doesn't seem that bad. Bring an Xbox. You know, that actually sounds a lot like my personal time. That said, other organisms find this acceptable. What the hell's wrong with you, Zach? Right? So an example of this is mold. Ah! Perfectly timed. Perfectly timed. Done pushing buttons. This is a perfectly acceptable solution to some organisms. That's one of them. Believe it or not, that's actually a picture of mold on nachos. So what's Zach's problem? The problem is that his default policy is the policy of a human being and not of mold. This is a perfectly acceptable solution to this. He's not mold. I'm pretty sure. And so, of course he's not going to pursue that as a solution, but there are organisms that do because that's their policy. Policy has become something that now defines an organism instead of reward. And that's really all I wanted to say. So I hope that at this point you've come to a few conclusions in a timely fashion. I would say that reward functions and default policies are equally valid ways of defining a decision-making organism. The free energy principle is nice in the sense that it provides a general and sensible mathematical framework for description of inference and decision-making. It's aesthetically pleasing, and so on and so forth. I hope you draw one third conclusion with this is the worst debate ever, because I've just spent my 20 minutes talking about what's right about the free energy principle or the free energy framework. Well, that's because I haven't gotten to the last bit. So is the free energy framework, I insist on calling it, unifying? And I would argue that yes, it is. It is precisely because it doesn't make a lot of assumptions, and most of the assumptions that it does make, you can kind of squeeze other things into, right? So here are the fundamental assumptions as I see it of the free energy framework, right? The brain has a model that includes a policy. It has a set of accessible approximations for the purposes of performing inference and action selection, which we call Q, right? And inference and action selection occurs simply by minimizing the, either KLQP or free energy or whatever you want to call it. As a result of it, it's an incredibly general theory, right? Anything can be incorporated, not anything, no, anything. I'm going to stick with anything. Just about any description of a behaving entity can be squeezed into the free energy form by judicious choice of your model that you're inverting, PM, which is what I called it, and your choice of approximations, Q. Anything. And I spent a lot of time trying to think of things that you couldn't include in the free energy principle, and I actually kind of, initially, I sort of thought, oh, well, sampling-based inference is a unique kind of inference. No, you can totally squeeze that into, what's a sample after all, right? What can you do with a sample? So you have 50 samples. What can you do with them? Well, I can evaluate free energy. I can get a point estimate, I can take an average, and to the extent that my sampling scheme is a good one, on average, free energy will be going down using a sampling-based inference scheme. Okay, so that gets in there too, so we kind of need to get rid of the what is not. How about non-Bayesian schemes? Totally you can get yes, this is very Bayesian by definition. There is a Bayesian brain. We do take into account uncertainty, but maybe not always. How can you fit a non-Bayesian scheme into this? Well, again, by judicious choice of Q, right? Typically, we like Q because Q can track variance and uncertainty about the properties of the world that we care about. But why not pick a Q that doesn't? Why not pick a Q that just says, oh, zero entropy Qs, that's all I'm allowed. Now you're basically doing map estimation and you're not behaving in a Bayesian way. But I've squeezed it in there anyway. So it can do anyway, and that's why I call it a framework and not a theory, right? It's great, it's a great mathematical language. It's a language that I hope we would all adopt because I understand it. It makes sense to me. But it provides very little guidance regarding the things that I actually care about, right? If there's no guidance within the, and I could be wrong, there's no guidance within this framework for choosing the generative models that the brain is using. There seems to be very little guidance for choosing Q. There is some. I would not say there's none, but there's very little guidance for how you're going to choose the kinds of approximations that the brain is using. There's, as far as I can tell, zero guidance for the optimization algorithm. And so here's a few that people like. And more critically, at least to me, there's almost no guidance in terms of the relationship between your beliefs, in this case your cues, right, and neural activity. It's simply agnostic. And that's what makes it a framework and not a theory. I just wanted to quote two people who said very smart things and phrased things much better than I could. The SG is Sam Gershwin, and his quote is that predictive failures of the free energy, he said principle, I say framework, are typically attributed to poor choice of your P's and your Q's. If you don't mind your P's and Q's, yes, thank you. I got one laugh out of that one. Oh, thank you, Eric. If you don't mind your P's and Q's, you will make bad predictions, and if you do, you can make good ones. But that's not a property of free energy. It's a property of your choice of models and inference algorithms. And Ralph Heffner is RH in this scenario. He basically reiterated the same thing using much better words than I would have chosen. That is that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Let's leave those up, shall we? And Dimitri, I'm going to give you a microphone so you can wander around the crowd and look for questions. And we have some online. And maybe we'll take a few minutes for Carl to address some of the points. Yeah, this is fine. Thank you. That we just heard. Whichever you'd like. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I thought you'd use all the good words, usually in the right order. And I like that P and Q thing. I never thought of that before. So for those of you who don't know, that comes from print in the old days when they used to print and they used to have different blocks of P's and Q's, and apprentices used to get them inverted. I always thought it was prepositions and questions and the like. It's just actually literally is getting the P's and Q's right. It's, so to take your last, I think, you've identified a number of really key issues, and unfortunately we're going to be in largely agreement here. So yeah, framework I think is perfectly fine. I use the word principle because it's essentially the free energy principle is just a variational principle of least action. Formally, mathematically, that is what it is. But if you want to use that to provide a framework within which to house or consider various process theories, I think that would be a very appropriate use of the word of a framework. But I've slipped in there the distinction between a process theory, which may or may not be consistent with the free energy principle, and the framework and the principle itself. And I think you're absolutely right that the framework does not prescribe a particular process theory, an inversion scheme, and more crucially, it doesn't provide what we all really want to know, which is the nature and the form and the physiology of the implicit generative models to which you apply the variation machinery under the framework or the principle. And I think there's implicit in some of your statements, which I agree with entirely, was at least a heuristic recourse to the complete class theorem or theorems that say for any pair of observed behaviors and loss function, there is a Bayes optimal solution. So I think you're absolutely right. The free energy principle framework cannot be wrong. It cannot be falsified, and of course, in the sense of a variational principle of least action, it doesn't have the attribute of being falsifiable. But any process theory can. But of course, to be a process theory, you'd have to write down the form of the generative model, what sorts of quantities it entails. Are you including inference about fast hidden states? Are you including learning about slow model parameters? Are you including structure learning? Are you including evolution? So all of these start to shape the form and separation of temporal scales and the hierarchical form of the generative model at hand. And of course, that's when all your process theories come in. Are you going to use sampling schemes, Bayesian Kalman filtering, predictive coding, belief propagation, variational message passing? All of these are process theories which you really have to commit to. And I think at that point, then the game is basically what we all do in our daily lives. There's no great gift there. It's just having a framework that highlights the connections between them. The other point you were making, which I haven't thought about before, was inverting the way that one defines the right sort of behavior in terms of the outcomes and reward or cost functions and just looking at that as a way of writing down the kinds of things that I do. You know, there are two equivalent ways, and I think formally that probably you could articulate that argument on the basis of the complete class theorem. So that's probably provably true, which means, as you intimated, it's a question of personal choice, which you commit to or you write about, or the rhetoric that you use. There was one point, though, which I thought deserved a bit more attention. You seem to have, I was going to use the word elided, but I can't. But you certainly have eluded. You have eluded the epistemic part. It is not the case that expected free energy in its general formalism can be reduced to a reward function. You have to have the information gain on top. So what that means is that the rat in the maze has to first explore to become familiar with the maze before it becomes exploitative in an RL sense. So I would actually challenge you that the equality which you are selling, which I think is a beautiful equality from the point of view of the complete class theorem, is a slight misdirection, because the whole point of the free energy, minimizing expected free energy, is it dissolves the exploration-exploitation dilemma.
I was just being, oh, sorry. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was just being lazy. I mean, of course, like, I completely left out observations. They were absent from those equations for a reason, because I feel like they just get in the way. But that is certainly part of it as well, right? Their information gain was implicit. What I was trying to do was just make a very specific link between reward and default policy. But it would have been included had I been more complete. That's all I have to say. I'm just saying I was being lazy. They're sort of high level, thank you.
Well, that's it.
I really have nothing else. We're going to hug it out in a second.
He did assure us this was going to end in a hug, so I'm going to hold him to that at the end.
Well, maybe just to follow up on that, some burning questions from the audience, one of which asked explicitly, does or can the free energy principle capture non-ORL systems? And if not, can it be considered unifying? You can't see that here. It's coming on this laptop. Does it capture non-ORL systems? Is that a way you'd phrase it? What you just described?
Right, capture non-reinforcement
learning systems.
I think it generalizes reinforcement learning. So that's one way of carving up that sort of expected free energy is in terms of expected reward, which we both wrote down as a log probability, or C for cost function. Or perhaps I didn't, but you did. So that would certainly subsume all the machinery, conceptual and mathematical, that you may want to bring to bear if you're using RL. But I repeat, that's not the complete picture. You need to equip that RL-like imperative with an information game, which is what I was referring to with the Lindley experiment, the imperatives of good experimental design. That, you know, what, in the absence of any rewards, there is still an imperative to go and get good data that is good in the sense of affording you information, resolving uncertainty. And I think that is exactly what you were talking about in terms of the good surprise. You know, it's the resolution of uncertainty afforded by epistemic affordance, which mathematically would be the thing that you'd have to add to an RL cost function in order to get an expected free energy. Okay. Now, did you mention inverse RL? Or no, you didn't. No. I mean, I imagine that's another sort of twist on this sort of duality, which. But I think to do that properly, you're going to have to put epistemics back in the resolution of uncertainty as a fundamental part of the objective function, sometimes known as salience, sometimes known as novelty. I call it epistemic affordance, because I like that. Giovanni Peluzzo told me to call it that, so I do.
Good. And so there's a question from Andre, but maybe is it following up on some of these? So there's questions on progress for this field, and in terms of how do the models come about initially, and how do we go about carefully deriving process theories from these assumptions, or somehow inferring the P and Q from data? Is that where we're going next then? Is that something the theory has helped us with, or will that narrow our investigations?
Let me see the question again. Yeah, so this is the how do you choose your P's and Q's? And I don't have a quick and ready response. I can tell you what we do in practice, which is we try to come up with sensible ones. For example, sparseness on natural images or things like that. And we just see how, and at the end of the day, we kind of just see how they work, right? We see what sort of things would be predicted, what kind of how is it consistent with behavior. We often use very simple tasks when we talk about things like the Bayesian brain. So we have very simple P's and very simple Q's that are often the actual P's from our task, right? That's often how a Bayesian brain experiment goes. You as an experimenter know what the P is, and you're really testing to see if the brain can figure that out too, through experience. As for Qs, if you're optimal, then your Q is just your posterior. Looking for causes of suboptimality is one of the ways in which we can identify the limitations of optimal inference, and that's how we would then select our Qs. Here's a simple experiment. So this is my favorite experiment. We talk about this one all the time. You're trying to do auditory visual localization. One possibility is that you're doing it optimally, so you take into account uncertainty on both of them. Another possibility is that you don't. And so that would that you do means that on every trial, your Q is a mean and a variance for both auditory localization and visual localization. And if you're not going to do it in a Bayesian way, if we see that it's not coming from behavior, the explanation would be that you're not tracking the variance on a trial-by-trial basis. You have some kind of fixed variance in mind. Ultimately, I think that's how you address these questions, right? You build tasks for which you can do the inversion. You know what the P is. You look at the kinds of deviations people have, humans, monkeys, whatever, mice, have from optimal behavior, and try to come up with explanations for them by by coming up with restrictions on Q. That says nothing about the neural code, so I hope that your question really wasn't about that.
And then how did the models arise in the first place? So do we just go back in early development to genetic priors, or are there any insights that we can take from this principle for how they arise? The generative models that you showed were necessary for this theory, but not necessarily for our RL-based policy selection.
So, I mean, the way that you'd normally frame those questions in terms of hierarchical Bayes. So, yeah, certainly you could look at different time scales in terms of evolution, neurodevelopment, experience-dependent learning, attentional control, synaptic efficacy, right down to fast fluctuations in responses to visual motion, as essentially being reflections of a hierarchical generative model where each level of the hierarchy affords empirical priors on the level below. And I guess in some sense could be looked at as doing a form of Bayesian model selection. So if you have a hierarchical model, questions like where do the priors come from, again, just go away. So they just come from the next level up. And you normally end up with evolution as you intimated, at the top level. But that's not a get out. You're then compelled to model evolution as a process, or natural selection as a process of Bayesian model selection. And it all comes then down to defining the relationship of the Q with the P. But the Q is now the phenotype, and the P is the environment. And natural selection now becomes a process of the environment selecting those phenotypes that are fit for purpose in terms of them being able to model P, the environment, until you get to humanity, when we start to design our own environments, and then you get into the world of eco-niche construction and free energy minimization at an ethological level, which you can go there if you want to.
So I'm not quite going to agree with that, because what you've done is you've introduced yet a third P. That's why I have a subscript for M, right? You said that P now, there's a third P. The P is the way the world actually works, which is, in my view, I mean, call this, how many scientific anti-realists are there out there? Like, that's inaccessible. It's not a thing, right? The only thing that you've got is what you can store, whether you're in your brain, what you can compute. That's either what's in your brain or what's in your genes. There is no P. There is only a P sub M.
You're coming out as a radical skeptist.
Absolutely.
In front of everybody.
Oh, yes. I've done it before. This is like when every once in a while someone says, what's the most controversial position you've ever taken? It's, I'm not sure you guys exist. I place no metaphysical significance on the latent variables of my models. So. I promised not to use philosophical terms, and I just violated that. I apologize.
So I'll be the structural realist then, if that helps. So the position that I would be forced to take, which probably is not the one I'd want to if I was not in a controversy, is that there is something real out there, and it is the P. And the Q and the P that the Q is predicated on, the sort of implicit generative model, which I agree entirely is not the real P, it's not the generative process, is constrained by the real P out there. But philosophically, it's a really interesting position because the whole sort of inferring from within the skull, when you just have access to data, and everything that you do is based upon an inference about what's out there that you'll never, ever actually directly connect with, really does force you into a skeptical position philosophically. The problem is that the free energy really does depend upon the goodness of those P's and Q's in the head in relation to something that's generating those sensory observations. So you're sort of forced back into a realist position just to motivate the machinery. So philosophically, it's very uncomfortable for me, but you are clearly comfortable being taking a skeptical position, so that's very nice.
Well, it doesn't matter. That's a nice thing about being a skeptic. It doesn't matter.
Right.
There's a really neat question here, and then we'll go to Andre, which is, will theories develop differently in the context of the free energy framework, if this isn't a theory?
No.
No. They'll go on without.
No, I'm happy with that answer.
Oh, just no.
No. Look, it's a language. Okay, sorry. Mic and soapbox. Yeah. It's a language. It's a way of talking about theories of brain function, in my view. It's a very useful one. But again, we can shoehorn, because of the freedom to choose our P's and Q's, we can shoehorn just about any computational framework into it. And so no, it would not develop differently, other than the fact that people might start talking about reward a little differently. That's a possibility. I think that's talking about reward and default policy as being exchangeable might be a good thing. It might be helpful in some sense. Again, it's certainly the case that we measure policies and we infer rewards, and maybe there'd be some benefit to that. I don't know. So no was maybe a little strong.
Well, I'm just wondering, I mean, in a sense, you intimated several ways that you could use the framework just to elaborate a whole bunch of process theories predicated on different kinds of generative models that then you could go to, as a neuroscientist, you could go to the empirical data. I mean, one thing that's hit me in the past few years is a fundamental distinction between generative models based upon discrete state spaces like Markov decision processes and hidden Markov models and the like, and those built around the assumption that you're dealing with continuous states like Bayesian filters, predictive coding, and the like. And just knowing that there are different sorts of generative models that carve in this way or that way, I think can put a lot of very useful constraints on the different hypotheses or process theories that you could then say, well, does it look as though the brain's doing this kind of message passing or that kind of message passing, or both? And then we can get into the argument about the neural code. What messages are actually being passed, and how is it biophysically represented? So I guess I'm agreeing with you that the specification, although the free energy principle has nothing to say about it, when you start to commit to a process theory and you start to commit to the generative model that will be apt for this experimental paradigm, you do actually narrow the hypothesis space about the biophysics that will be doing the inference and the kinds of behaviors and neurophysiology that you would see from that. And then you just Bayesian model selection in the normal way to adjudicate.
Andre, do you want to give us your question?
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. So I think in both presentations we focused a lot on the NEATs and also on the mystics. And are physiologists mystics actually also? That's not my full question. I'll just say that we are, then fine. Then, so we have the physicists and the physiologists, psychologists, and so on the other side. But in between, the scruffies, we haven't discussed that very much. And of course, a substantial part of the conference are people from engineering and that are trying to use some of these principles to make better models. So I was wondering if either the free energy principle or theory has informed that engineering, very practical approach, and if so, how? And the other question, because we're in an interdisciplinary setting here, it seems like we are in a perfect setting to explore the confluence of those three groups together. And I was wondering what you think we can actually learn from each other and what the interactions should be between the scruffies, the neats, and the mystics.
I'll say something. So I barely remember what those three things are. So scruffies were engineers, is that right? Neats were physicists. What was the third one? Mystics. Mystics were philosophers, and then where were we putting the physiologists?
I was going to say with the mystics.
With the mystics. Yeah. I don't know how the free energy framework particularly can bring these groups together or explicate their differences, but I do see a general way forward that is related to like the Bayesian brain hypothesis, which is that the role of the engineers is to enhance, it's terrible, is to enhance our computational space of models to give us more P's for which we can find Q's and actually do inference. So this is like saying we can use artificial intelligence to help us figure out maybe how real intelligence works. Physiologists obviously provide the constraints on what biology can do, which also tells us something about behavioral, the cues that are accessible, I think, to some extent. And philosophers,
Well, there's none here. So.
oh, I'm sure there's one here.
Are there any philosophers here?
Philosophers can tell us what the right words to use are. That was pretty dismissive.
Do you want to go for that one too? Also, someone has asked, could Carl minimize my free energy by speaking a bit louder?
Great. Sorry. Right.
This is very enjoyable, by the way. Keep it coming. We're trying to get to them.
I'd be interested in your answer, to be quite honest. I mean, you do electrophysiology. You are well versed in active inference and some of the maths. So when you've got your electrophysiology cap on, do you regard yourself as high church theorist, or are you a mystic? I would have actually put you with the scruffists. I think electrophysiologists need to have a formal understanding of the system that they are trying to characterize, and they are in the game, I think, of testing the process theories that we've been talking about, doing the real heavy lifting. But they need to be able to appeal to some theoretical framework in order to provide a mathematical rigor to their analyses and to their conclusions. My experience is that they choose what works. So that would bring them into the scruffies camp. And you're hearing the dialogue here as to why it's good to be a neat, or perhaps you're not. What do you think?
Yeah, I like being with the scruffies, doing something very practical. Yeah, but of course it has to be informed. We have an infinite space of possible experiments, so we need to basically use a theory to inform what experiments we will do. And even if a theory is conceptual, only conceptual, it's you still need to have something to ground yourself in as a physiologist. Mm-hmm. I was also wondering, though, just in terms of the pure computational space, people from AI and so on, has there been any progress in using free energy principles in that space? And if so, could you talk about them a little bit?
It's not my field, but my limited knowledge of it is it's making more headway, as one might imagine, in things like neurorobotics. So we're talking about the construction of real-world artifacts. So on the purely software side, deep learning is the oil tanker that is moving forward, and that's what everybody uses. To be controversial, I think that's exactly in the wrong direction. And it's obvious why. Well, sorry, it should be obvious why I say that, not why it's in the wrong direction. It's all about simplicity. It's always about carefully choosing the smallest amount of data in the algorithmically, minimally complex way to get to the same reduction of uncertainty or increase in evidence. So that means the challenge is using small amounts of data, very carefully selected, to solve the problem. That's not what current sort of industry artificial intelligence is interested in. It's going in exactly the other direction, exploiting the availability of very large amounts of data labels, exploiting, leveraging Moore's law, and actually celebrating the computational complexity. For me, that's obscene, because the computational complexity is part of the variation-free energy. It is fundamental, this variation principle of least action. So I haven't seen much movement in that, and indeed we have been told by the good and great in charge of the money in this area that, you know, some bright-eyed youngster like you or somebody like me is not going to change the direction of this oil tanker. That's where it's going. But in neurorobotics, certainly at a non-industrial scale, where you actually have to make real things actively engage and interact with the world, I see active inference making a much more simple, elemental, and fundamental difference. Just putting servers in place of reflexes, inferences planning on top of existing robotics, starting to think more about sort of interpersonal dialectic exchanges with robotics and the like. I see that's probably industry-wise making a difference from a purely engineering perspective.
And just on the physics, I've one question here from Ralph Hafner at the University of Rochester, who's asking, does the free energy principle also apply to purely physical systems? If so, how is it different from Hamilton's principle of least action? And if so, what does it add? And if it does not apply to purely physical systems, wouldn't that make it falsifiable after all? And just to mention, there's been at least 10 or 15 people asking whether the theory is falsifiable, so maybe you could...
This is all you. That is clearly a question for the physicist. And not
I'll do the physicist one, but the falsifiable one, that's yours. Okay. You've religiously not used the word scheme. You've been very careful in the use of the word frameworks.
Well, I think you should go first.
Oh,
the first
sorry.
half of the question was for
right,
you.
My apologies. So the free energy principle, the way the story was told here was concise, almost to the point of being tongue-in-cheek about what the underlying equations are, what it would look like from the point of view of biological sciences. But the backstory is a version of Hamilton's principle of least action. Not actually Hamilton's principle of least action, but it is a variational principle of least action. It certainly applies to physical systems. In fact, we'll go a little bit further. It would say that physical systems inherit from the same variational principles that give rise to the free energy principle. So the idea is you've got this sort of variational principles based upon random dynamical systems. When you have random fluctuations that dominate those, you get quantum physics. When you deal with ensembles, you get statistical thermodynamics, or more precisely, stochastic thermodynamics. When you take random fluctuations out of the game, you get classical mechanics, and then you get Lagrangian Newtonian mechanics, and Hamiltonians come to the fore. And when you put the Markov blanket, which we haven't spoken about, but if we frame this self-organization in terms of inference, you then get the Bayesian mechanics, which is the free energy principle. So it doesn't explain physics, but it inherits from exactly the same maths that quantum physics and other physics explain. Again, it's not falsifiable, it's not there to be falsified, it's not a theory that requires evidence, it's just a mathematical truism.
Clear.
I'll answer your question.
Well, I've one for Jeff here. So someone has asked, following up, which I think is an interesting question, which you've touched on Ramstead et al.'s 2019 work. Are generative models better conceived as encoded in the brain or enacted by agent and environment? Where does the model live?
If it has a subscript M, it's in your brain. I think that's my short answer. It is part of the definition. It is part of the definition of your computational energy. Is the set of available generative models, right? And then the other thing that's important is the restrictions on the set of posterior distributions that you're capable of computing and representing. So brain. Of course, as an extreme skeptic, There is nothing outside of that. So I think that's why I have my answer that I'm happy with.
I'd agree. It's the free energy gradients that drive the dynamics. You need to define the generative model to define the gradient, but it's the gradient itself that does the heavy lifting. Therefore, strictly speaking, there is no generative model sub M. It's just that which would be necessary to explain the gradient flows and the dynamics. He's frowning. Good. We found a point of controversy.
It sounds like you're saying that you don't need to know the. Sorry, it sounds like you're saying you don't need to know. You don't need to even have a generative model as long as you have the gradients.
I think from the point of view of a physicist, that's probably right, yes. But if you wanted to interpret...
Well, what if I don't want to do gradient descent? I like coordinate descent, personally. And so those gradients are a little different.
I think even when you move to a coordinate descent... So I don't mean to say that you can write down a scheme that will optimize something or self-organize to a particular attracting set of states in the absence of a generative model. I'm just saying... The generative model is a mathematical construct. You will only find it expressed in the machinery doing the message passing, the coordinate descent or the gradient descent in the brain itself. So you'll see reflections of it like cortical hierarchies in a hierarchical generative model, the factorization into where and what in terms of a mean field approximation of latent causes of the sensory input. But mathematically, the generative model in and of itself does not exist as a physical object.
Is that still true when you're doing model comparison inside the brain because you have multiple generative models that are currently in sync? Because it seems to me in that situation, you do need to evaluate the probability of the data given each of your models for the purposes of comparison, in which case you would need them in some sense.
Yeah, and I think that's true at two senses. One is me trying to observe your brain and trying to work out what generative model you are implicitly using, sometimes said to entailing. Your brain entails a generative model to make it clear there's no commitment to a physical instantiation of the generative model. It's just that the message passing is consistent with you using that generative model. So that would be me as a neuroscientist looking at your brain and trying to infer your generative model. I think from the point of view of you actually using a generative model, that's a slightly simpler situation, which I'm sure you can capture under your skeptical position. But it's just an interesting way the question was framed. Are we a generative model, or are we a process, a policy, that can be described as if it was optimizing a generative model defined by its priors? So it's subtle.
Exactly the question.
It's a subtle question, and it comes back to...
And also irrelevant to the skeptic.
Yes, you don't have to worry about it. But it is consistent with your focus on defining phenotypes in terms of the things they do, their policies. So, a thing is a policy. It is not the generative model that explains why you are doing that planning as inference.
Look like you have the generative model. So there's a question here on Jeff's default policy from Roberto Gulli at Columbia, who says, what's the reasoning behind choosing default over prior? So who gave out to you, and how does it relate to the ability to potentially update it if it's a default rather than a prior?
Right. So you do update your default policy as soon as you receive sensory information, which was the part that was left out of those particular slides, which I've already apologized. The reason why I don't use the phrase policy prior is because of the visceral reaction that I received from that man. I mean, that literally is the whole reason. I mean, so I think that maybe someone should hand Zach a mic and ask him why the visceral reaction.
Carl, you put up on the screen Q of pi, which is a prior over policies. And Jeff, you put up on the screen P of S prime given S, which is a default dynamics. Those are two different things. And I don't know what the relationship is between them, but they're different.
Well,
and the policy by itself is the probability of choosing actions given a belief state.
Okay, so if I'd simply put a prior on A, sorry, not a prior on A because I changed notation halfway through. If I'd used pi and Q of pi instead of U, I would have been allowed to call it a policy prior.
It was the way that it's the meaning of what you were using. The symbols were talking about the default dynamics of the states, which is not what you do. That's what you assume happens when you're just letting things go.
So
and that's equivalent to a reward.
Yes, so in practice, and not in my example, there is in fact a policy prior.
You got to ask somebody else for that one. I don't know.
No, because there is a Q of pi, right? Or sorry, there's a P of pi. And pi is a probability distribution over distributions.
We could take a vote. From my point of view, I just slipped in planning as inference because just to demystify all this sort of epistemic value, instrumental value, and the connection between RL and optimal Bayesian decision theory. The expected free energy formalism is just planning as inference. That's all it is. But it's just, it incorporates both the normal optimum Bayesian design that, Andre, as an electrophysiologist, you are complying with those principles. When you design your experiment, you're working out what data should I go and sample, solicit from my lab world in order to reduce my uncertainty over the different hypotheses that I am entertaining at the moment. And I think the answer was that these frameworks provide the good hypothesis space that means you don't waste your time acquiring data that doesn't resolve the uncertainty. The Q over pi is a posterior, in fact. So planning as inference is just how do you optimize your posterior beliefs about what to do next. So pi is not a mapping between, it's not a state action policy as in RL, or optimal control theory, where it's actually a mapping between I'm in this state and I have to do that. So the active inference framework is much more general and deals with sequential policy optimization, where there are multiple policies or sequences of actions in play, and they're denoted by Q, and as you say, they have a posterior, which means they have to have a prior. Interestingly, the prior is the softmax function of the expected free energy. So from my point of view, you can have them, but possibly not in the sense that you were arguing about.
Can I just, so if active inference give us something on top of reinforcement learning, is there a class of tasks that would be solvable by one framework or theory versus the other?
Yes, sequential policy optimization in the case where you need to go and sample data, that will change your beliefs. So I notice you use the word belief state. There's a lot of confusion about that. So a belief state is actually a state of belief that has all the sufficient statistics, including the uncertainties. And of course, to encode completely would require you to have an infinite dimensional Markov decision process to do that. So problems in which making that move resolves uncertainty about what would happen if I then did that. So do I go to a restaurant, or do I go to the, do I make my own meal at home, requires you first to resolve the uncertainty about whether you have the right ingredients in your cupboard or in your fridge. So your policy has to incorporate your belief state, your prior beliefs at the point of acting, knowing that your beliefs will change as time goes on. So there is no strict RL scheme that can solve that problem.
I see, yeah. Sometimes then reformulating mathematically, RL could lead to solutions of new paradigms. So reformulation, mathematical reformulation has some added value. That's my comment.
So first of all, I will sheepishly admit to being reviewer too, but in my defense, I don't think Elide...
Mr. Eliding.
I don't think Elide is such an esoteric word. But I had a real question, which goes back to falsifiability, which I think a lot of people are interested in here. And let me just make sure I understood Jeff's proposed experimental strategy. So you're thinking about defining some generative model, imposing it on an experimental subject, so that you know what the optimal policy is, the optimal posterior is, and then looking for deviations and thinking and trying to examine to what extent you could explain those deviations in terms of some restriction on the posterior. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So that strikes me as not being a strategy for falsification, because assuming that the way in which you pick you're looking for restrictions such that when you minimize free energy, that restriction will satisfy the minimal free energy. That's maybe implicit in the way that you've set it up, but maybe not. It seemed to me that what you'd really want to be doing is impose the generative model, separate or at least separately elicit people's assumptions about the generative model, and try to then characterize their prior beliefs in terms of some restriction on the variational family before they've seen data, right? And then ask, after they've seen data, would the posterior within that restricted family reduce free energy? And note that it doesn't have to minimize free energy, so that kind of short circuits the question about the algorithms, because even if you just take a gradient step in that direction, you're at least reducing it. But if the free energy ever went up, if people ever chose an approximate posterior that increased free energy, that would be, I think, decisive falsification of the free energy framework, conditional on having pinned down all the other pieces.
Well, perhaps not. Like, not enough samples is a reason why free energy can blip up.
Well, it depends how what you mean when you're talking about samples. So there could be a sample-based variational family, but then that would be part of your specification of the variational family that you do in the first part of the experiment. Or I think what you're saying is maybe that people are approximating the free energy, the expectation, with a bunch of samples, and they didn't take enough samples. Is that what you're talking
That's
about?
one, so I mean, in my experience, there are two reasons why free energy goes up.
Yeah.
It's usually because that's the hardest thing to code up,
Yeah.
is the evaluation of free energy for me, personally. So in other words, it's a bug. And the other cause is because I'm doing something I'm using some kind of stochastic method.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's the only thing that ever causes it to go up in my experience. But then again, how would we evaluate that behaviorally? Like, I don't know. I just want to clarify, in respect to your question, what you're actually falsifying in the silly example I gave is that the brain is optimally Bayesian.
Right. But
on this on
that's
this
already
task.
false, right?
No.
Yeah.
Yes. But well, depends on the task. Right? I could probably, I guarantee you that there are some tasks out there.
But in general,
which,
right? There's plenty of examples where the brain is not optimally Bayesian, right?
That's right.
The interesting question.
That's right.
is
And those are the interesting examples, right? Because that's where we can start like nailing down the question. Okay, the falsifiable thing is the brain optimally Bayesian? No. Now we need an explanation. There are a variety of different explanations, many of which would take two forms, at least within this framework, right? Wrong P, wrong Q, or severely limited Q. Mm-hmm. And we have to explore those. We can do model comparison to see which one is right, completely within this framework, in terms of right as in best fit to behavior, and that's the best you can do.
No,
so the thing is, the funny thing about talking about falsifiability is that to a large extent, it's not, this is not a falsifiable theory. Most theories of interest, complicated theories are not really falsifiable, in my opinion. No, right? It's really, we would love to live in the, we would love to live in, I'm just going to finish, it's okay. Trust me, I'm just going to interrupt you until I'm done. I would love to live in a nice world of falsifiable theories, but at this point we don't have any, right? We have descriptions of behavior, some are better than others, and we use model comparison to say this is right, this is wrong. Very interesting that happens a lot of times when we're looking at human behavior is that there isn't a single model that fits everybody. It's incredibly rare. People use a variety of different strategies to solve exactly the same problem, often with very minimal differences in reward rates. Well, talk about specifics later, it's not really important now. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with the best description of behavior. And again, this is now the skeptic talking one more time, last time, I promise. Oh crap, I skitzed out on what I was gonna say.
Variety of ways to do the problem.
No, that was, okay, yes. No, okay. At the end of the day, science, in my opinion, is about prediction and data compression and not about truth. It never bothers me at all when a hypothesis is not falsifiable. I really only care about those two things, and prediction is really the only thing I care about.
I think the point still stands.
And if I'm marginalizing, I mean, that's the automatic Occam's razor effect of doing Bayesian inference, right? Yeah, you got a bunch of models that are way over parameterized, they're not really useful, so what do you do with them? Low posterior probability, they're gone. You're doing great prediction because you've focused on the models that actually work.
But my point was, I guess, less about falsification and more just about, is there some distinctive prediction specifically of free energy that is independent of the particular choice of P and Q? And the core prediction has to be that free energy has to go down, right? Yeah. And so if it goes down,
if it doesn't, it's because you're using the wrong Q. That's the sense in which it's not falsifiable. That's like a direct, I think it's still on the board. That SG is you. Paraphrase slightly.
SG is what?
Sam.
Yes, right. Oh, I see. SG is, I'm with you, good.
Thanks. More on falsifiability, because I would, if I can leave this debate and not spend the next several years testing a hypothesis that cannot be true, or maybe is trivially true, I would like to avoid it. So just to bring it back to some of the work that we've seen today, the Scruffies have given us over the past several years a bunch of neural networks. They take images and they do some computation, and they produce activity states. And some of them are generative and some of them are not. And what you can do with each one of these networks is take these activity states and regress them onto the brain, and you get a prediction. And right now, one of the neural networks that gives us really accurate predictions, reasonably accurate predictions, is ALEKS, and it's a discriminative network, and it's not generative. So I don't know. I mean, that's a hypothesis. It could be true or it could be false. And so it seems like one of the things that might be falsifiable here is the assumption of that P of M lives in the brain, because there are other computing things that are not generative models, unless I'm just not thinking about AlexNet as creatively as I need to.
I don't know if it's a question of thinking creatively. If you were a Scruffy, you wouldn't need to. I mean, Scruffies is not meant to be a derogatory term. I think the majority of us are Scruffies, but it certainly is easy to reconceive those deep convolutional networks we saw in the last talk in terms of an amortized inversion of a generative model. In fact, there'd be a very graceful set of schemes that you could, if you went to any commercial AI company, they could write down a variation autoencoder and then amortize that, and you would end up with the sorts of schemes. And in a sense, and I love that presentation because for me, what was being done was essentially different forms of generative models were being assumed, and they were being, for convenience, amortized using current deep learning architectures, and being put forward as working hypotheses for a process theory for sort of broad-scale functional anatomy, hierarchical anatomy in the brain. And getting that right factorization, I think, underneath the shape and the form of the models, and at what point do they diverge into sort of dual tasking face versus object. These are exactly the structure learning problems that present themselves when you don't know the form of the generative model. So I think it'd be quite easy to, with the right Rosetta Stone, start to talk the language that I would understand to describe that very set of results. But you have to you have to understand that all of these deep networks are just universal function approximators. What are they approximating? The mappings that matter. What are the mappings that matter? They are mappings from data space to beliefs, inferences. They're just amortizing or summarizing learning, how to infer, how to categorize, how to predict, and all of that should, at the end of the day, be described as a variation-free engine minimization.
Yeah. Thank you. In the interest of time and for the next session, I'm going to ask our discussants if they're satisfied and if they have any closing statements. Satisfied with the debate?
I'm not satisfied yet.
Will you ever be satisfied?
I'm waiting for something very specific.
He wants his hug.
Okay, they're going to hug. Thank you all for your patience and your attendance and your great questions.